Hello fellow cyborgs, and welcome to my Victober 2019 wrap-up. There are two classics that I finished technically before Victober started, and I do want to include them here in this kind of like classics wrap-up. I finally finished Desperate Remedies by Thomas Hardy in this very lovely edition that has even a map. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, and my one-line sum up of my experience with this book is that this plot was just absolute bonkers. I am going to do a full review of this in my Hardy Har Har series, so be on the lookout for that if you want to hear more details about Desperate Remedies. I also finished Bleak House like 2 days before Victober started. I was listening to the audiobook narrated by Simon Vance and then watching Katie from Books and Things videos where she talks about the different chapters we were supposed to have read over the course of a year and a half. Those were just such motivating forces that I finished listening to the audiobook in like a week. Immediately after finishing the audiobook of Bleak House, I wanted to reread it. I felt like I had rushed through it a little bit just for the sake of getting it off my TBR, but that the way that the story developed after the first 100 pages that I had already previously read just blew my mind. A lot of the characters were so interesting. There were so many interesting plot points in this. This is definitely up there as one of my favorite Dickens, even though when I started reading this, I didn't think that would be the case. So as you already saw in my classics I want to reread video, this is definitely up there. 4 out of 5 stars. This definitely makes me want to try even more of the Dickens I haven't yet. And also reread him. That's probably the thing I want to do the most, is just reread the Dickens that I've read. Let's talk about some DNFs. Some of them are permanent and others are just temporary. I decided to permanently not finish In a Glass Darkly by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. Last year or the year before for Victober, I read Carmilla, Green Tea, and The Familiar, and I gave Carmilla 3 stars and the other 2 just 2 stars. I didn't really enjoy them, so I just had Mr. Justice Harbottle and The Room in Le Dragon Volant to finish, and I started reading both of them and didn't care. I wasn't enjoying the writing style, so I decided that this collection is just not for me. If I want to reread Carmilla, I can do it in a different form. I can get just Carmilla if I want to own it, or I can get it from the library or something. So I didn't want to spend my time slogging through these stories that at best would have gotten 3 stars, so I also did not finish Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Sarai from Sarai Talks Books and I were buddy reading this, but we got to chapter 9, and it was just very slow and not what we wanted. Sarai was the one who pulled the plug, and I was actually really glad that she did, because the buddy read that we picked up instead ended up being so incredibly enjoyable. Sorry about the sparkles on my face. So I'm planning on tackling this maybe through audiobook and maybe just reading it before the end of the year. I do hope to finish this before the end of the year, but so far I definitely am not enjoying this. I'm not as pulled into it than the other 4 Gaskell novels that I've previously read. So not a permanent DNF, but this wasn't the time. I also didn't finish He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope. This is a really big book, and the buddy I'm reading with had other books that she was juggling, so we are slowly making our way through this. I'm hopefully going to finish this in November or December at the latest. I definitely don't want this reading experience to continue very much longer. I think we started reading this in September. I'm still enjoying it, but I do want to pick up the pace. The rest of the books I have to talk to you about were really good reads, so get ready for 4 stars. Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell was a really pleasant surprise. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. When I was reading it, I thought maybe this is going to be a 5-star read. This might be another favorite Gaskell, but the ending did confuse and disappoint me. I am planning on talking about this more in my Tess versus Ruth video that will be coming up hopefully shortly, but overall let me just say that Ruth is actually more of an ensemble novel than I was expecting. We do start out with Ruth as our main character and pretty much our POV character, but later we are introduced to the Bensons, who are some of the most lovely characters, especially their housemaid or house servant, Sally, who is hilarious. We also get to learn about a family, the Bradshaws, and specifically a daughter named Jemima. These 2 family groups are pretty much as important to the novel as Ruth. That was a surprise for me, but a pleasant one, because Ruth is a little bit too sweet of a cinnamon bun. She has like no flaws except for the fact that she is a fallen woman, but I think modern audiences wouldn't count that as a flaw against her. I really enjoyed this writing style. There were surprisingly quite a lot of nature descriptions in here, even though this takes place more in towns and I wouldn't call it a rural book. So this tiptoed through fast conversations and interesting character introspection, and then the more flowery writing style about nature. It was a really lovely blend. This also is a book that really does believe that people can be good people and can change, and that just because society says to do one thing, that doesn't mean it's the right thing. So again, 4 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend Ruth. If you're worried about the religion in here being heavy-handed, I myself am not a religious person, and I did not find this irritating. So don't forget Ruth, it's definitely worth the read. I also finished listening to Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This I buddy read with M.A. Anders. I listened to the audiobook narrated by 2 narrators, David Timpson and Janet McTeer. Since this is narrated through Mr. Lockwood and then Nellie Dean's recountings of what happens at Wuthering Heights, I thought the 2 narrators was a brilliant idea. Also, Janet McTeer, who narrated Nellie Dean's segments, had, from what I can tell at least, a Yorkshire accent, which was really interesting to hear since I don't know that accent very well and I don't think about that accent when I'm reading this book. It was fun to hear how the characters might actually have spoken. As always, I gave Wuthering Heights 4 out of 5 stars, or at least as always for at this moment in my life. This is a book that I do not completely love, but I still think is a really fascinating read. This rereading experience, the only thing that changed for me was how I viewed the ending. This is not spoilery. Previously, I had viewed the ending as kind of romantic, but now I think of it more as a kind of a sad and limiting decision for the characters. So that was kind of interesting. After our failed buddy read of Sylvia's Lovers, Sarai and I decided to try Anthony Trollope's Dr. Wordle's School. This is a fairly short book. I think it's less than 250 pages, and this is a standalone novel by Anthony Trollope. This was such a pleasant surprise. This has to do with Dr. Wordle and his school, but specifically one of his right-hand men, Mr. Peacock, and his wife. They have a secret that we learn about pretty early on, but I won't spoil because, surprise. I especially love this reveal because Anthony Trollope says in the book, "I'm about to tell you the secret that most novels would spare to the second to last chapter. If you feel like knowing the secret is going to spoil your reading experience, then you should just put the book down now, because I think books can have merit, suspense, and intrigue without there being a secret you're still trying to find out." I really love when Anthony Trollope talks to the reader like that. This book was a lot about morality versus ethics. There were lots of plot twists and turns. There's even a trip to America. It was really good, and I am really glad that it was as short as it was, because there was not a lot of repetition, unlike some Trollope works that I have read. I really recommend this. This is a great place to start for Anthony Trollope, or a great palate cleanser if you want to read a Trollope, but you don't want to continue on with his Chronicles of Barsetshire or the Palliser series. 4 out of 5 stars, I highly recommend, and I'm really glad this impromptu buddy read turned out to be a great one. My favorite Victorian novel that I read this year will probably surprise you. It's The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. This is an author that I was one book away from never reading again. I was actually thinking about not even reading The Mayor of Casterbridge since I had had such lackluster experiences with Tess and Desperate Remedies. Desperate Remedies was fine, but it didn't blow my socks off. And I was thinking about just unhauling this. But then my library had the audiobook available. I had finished my audiobook reading of Wuthering Heights, and I decided, I'll just, listen to it while I do stuff. The audiobook I listened to was narrated by Pamela Gerlich, and she did a really great job. I don't think she's the most outstanding narrator, but for some reason, she just was someone I could listen to for hours on end. She was able to keep the characters distinct in my mind, and they all sounded quite different from one another, especially Mr. Farfrae, who had a Scottish accent, which I think she did a pretty good job on. The best thing about The Mayor of Casterbridge is that most horrible things that happen aren't to people you particularly care for, so unlike Tess, which is soul-sucking and so incredibly unfair, this was a very interesting book on justice, I guess you could say. I'm going to talk about this more in detail in my Hardy Har Har series, so if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts on The Mayor of Casterbridge, check that video out. But this was a 4 out of 5 star read, and probably one of my favorite Victorian novels. Strange, huh? So those were the things I did and did not finish for Victober. I absolutely love Victober, and I'm really glad that the hosts put it on for another year, and I will eagerly await next year's Victober as well. Please let me know in the comments down below, if you have read Ruth, what did you think about the ending? I would really like to hear some other people's thoughts than just my own, which are mostly confused. And if you haven't read Ruth, let me know what your favorite Victober read of this year was. Or the dud. I would also love to hear complaining. Thank you for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely.